Okay, good afternoon all, and a very warm welcome to you to this next instalment of the Coffee Seminar Series. I'm Ben Hayes and I head up the Centre of Animal Science at the Coffee, and without further ado, we'll launch into a acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. And on behalf of the traditional owners, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions both to Australia and global society. So a couple of housekeeping things before we launch into today's seminar. This seminar will run from now until 1 p.m. and at the end of Jill's seminar, we'll have a Q&A session. And just a reminder that the way to ask questions is using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, not the chat button. So we'll be looking at what comes up in the Q&A window. And we'll get onto those once Jill is finished, as I said. So now to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jill Fernandes has a very interesting background. I think it's quite unique in coffee anyway. She's a decision scientist, and Dr. Fernandes joined UQ about 4 years ago after conducting a Fulbright Scholarship in Germany and a PhD in environmental science and policy at the University of Miami. Jill is trained as an interdisciplinary scientist, and she currently undertakes research in the field of decision science with a focus on policy problems, particularly in animal welfare and decisions in animal welfare. And through her work, Dr. Fernandes aims to empower people to make better decisions about the messy, complex problems facing our society, of which animal welfare is definitely one. And having got to know Dr. Fernandes over the last 4 years, she also has a unique ability to empower the senior scientists she works with, or very senior scientists she works with, through quite amazing organisational skills and scientific input as well. So it's been the work we've done, particularly Jill's work with Alan Tilbrook and so on, has been quite amazing, as I think you'll see. Okay, Jill, over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. I'll turn my camera on now. Thank you. And
you might want to turn yourself up just a little bit too, Jill.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh. Can you hear me now? If I just talk loud, Ben, or is it still quite quiet?
No, that's good. That's fine.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Ben, for that great introduction. And I too acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respect to their ancestors and their descendants. And today I'll be talking about assessing animal experiences and why this is a transdisciplinary challenge. If I were to leave you with one key message today, though, it's silly to not collaborate. And as Ben mentioned, this has been one of my main roles at the university, is getting different disciplines, senior scientists, to collaborate around the complex challenges we face. So this is the key message. You guys can all go home now. We're good. But seriously, my aim today is to convince you of why this is the case for animal welfare. So before we begin, I'd just like to give a little bit of history. I love science history, and so I'd like to share a bit with you, but it is relevant to the topic we're discussing today, and you'll soon see why. So Ruth Harrison was born in London in 1920 to a family of Quakers. The Quaker origin is important because Quakerism isn't a very dogmatic religion, but it's one that believes heavily in relying on your conscience to make decisions and to live your life. So Ruth grew up a Quaker. But she also grew up in an interesting time in Europe, especially in London. As many of you would know, there was the bombing of London during World War II, and it was a very difficult time to live in London. And so she experienced this while she was going through university. And also during this time, food was a problem, food security in the UK. So during this time is when really the UK government made efforts to secure more food by intensifying agriculture in the UK so that UK would not have to rely on other countries as much for their food, in particular their meat. So Ruth wasn't particularly interested in animals or animal rights per se. She just went to university. She then was a nurse in the war. But in 1961, something very pivotal happened that changed her mind. She received this pamphlet about intensified agriculture, and it really changed the rest of her career. So she received this pamphlet saying, cheap food, yes, but is it good food? And it went on to detail some of the standard husbandry practices that were happening at that time in intensive agriculture. And so Ruth, being a curious person she was, decided to make it her life's mission to discover whether this was true or not, and to go and see for herself. So she spent her career going around and investigating different livestock production systems and trialing different methods of animal husbandry. I even read that she trialed CO2 on herself because she wanted to know what the effect was of CO2 as a method of euthanasia. So she tried mild levels of CO2 to experience what that was like. And so she documented all of these very systematically throughout her life. And she summarized the evidence in a book called Animal Machines, which was released in 1964. And she even got Rachel Carson, the environmentalist, to write a foreword for this book. So this book became quite popular in the UK and actually throughout the world. And it raised a lot of societal concern in the UK around how animals were being treated in agriculture. And so much so that the government needed to have a response. So the response of the UK government was to establish the Farm Animal Welfare Council and the Bramble Committee specifically to look into practices in agriculture, in livestock agriculture. And the results of this committee over several years was the development of a framework of the certain responsibilities that we have to animals under our care, known as the 5 freedoms, which was later expanded upon by David Mellor into the 5 domains. And this infographic here, which is a very handy infographic produced by Animal Health Australia, sort of explains the 5 domains, which is that if we're going to have animals under our care, then we need to look after them. We need to make sure they have adequate nutrition, a good environment, that they're healthy, and that they're able to express behavior naturally. So if all of these things are in check, then in theory, this should lead to a positive mental state as opposed to a negative one. So the animal should be experiencing positive experiences. Another person that I'd like to tell you about that also related, you may have heard of as well. Archie Cochrane was around about the same time as Ruth Harrison. He was a Scottish doctor, and he worked primarily in POW camps during World War II. So they would have all these POW, prisoners of war, delivered to him, and he would go around trying to take care of them all. And he documented his experiences and published extensively about it. But one of the things that really bothered Archie a lot was that taking care of these POWs, many of whom had tuberculosis, there were not very good evidence-based ways of treating these patients. So they would be treated kind of without very precise diagnostics, and no one really knew if the treatments worked or not. So this bothered Archie, and throughout his career, the lack of evidence. And so he collated all of his reflections into this book, Effectiveness and Efficiency, and really advocated for the use of randomized control trials in medicine to determine whether certain practices actually had a benefit or whether there was just a placebo. And of course, afterwards, there was the Cochrane Collaboration was formed in his honor, and they now publish Cochrane reviews, which are systematic reviews of the evidence on various topics, so that doctors can make very informed and rigorous decisions in medicine. So why am I telling you about this? This is agriculture. Why are we talking about medicine? Well, actually, if we look on a political science level, all of these things sort of had a ripple effect. So Cochrane contributed to evidence-based medicine, and very much that became a trend in medicine that is still active today. That then led to the need for evidence-based policy, and this became popular in the 1970s following the rise of evidence-based medicine. And so now you have governments really needing to justify their decisions based on evidence and metrics of what's happening in the country. This then had a flow-on effect in other aspects of society. So now you have businesses insisting on using metrics for decision making, and even in animal science and in animal care, we would like some evidence on which to base our decisions for animal management. So why did I tell you about Ruth and Archie? Well, they put us in our current dilemma that we're facing. On one hand, we have a responsibility to look after the animals under our care. So Ruth Harrison definitely raised awareness of this, and now this awareness is very alive in society, and people are becoming more and more aware of it all the time. A second trend was started, though, is that we need to make decisions based on evidence. So how are we going to do this is the question. For animal welfare, ideally, we would like some evidence that what we're doing is working, that the welfare of the animal is positive most of the time. But just by looking at this animal, how are we going to know? We would like some information on the transient state within that animal. If we could go inside that animal's brain and figure out what that animal is experiencing, that would be the ideal piece of evidence that we're looking for. And this is what we refer to as animal welfare. This is what the animal experiences. And this is our greatest challenge, is to understand this topic. So take, for instance, this animal here, Basset Hound. As many of you would know, I'm a fan of Basset Hounds. This Basset Hound is yawning. So traditionally in animal welfare science, we've developed behavioral indicators of welfare. So you see how an animal is behaving, and you can try to make an informed decision about what that animal is experiencing. And some behavioral indicators are better than others. But take, for instance, this behavioral indicator, a yawn in a dog. So there could be a lot of different things. We could have just taken this Basset Hound to the park. Basset Hounds are quite lazy, so maybe he played for 5 minutes and he's happy, he's fulfilled, he's got his exercise for the day, and he's having a yawn, he's tired, okay? That's one scenario. But what's a different scenario? Maybe, it's 5:25 and he eats at 5:30, and he knows that it's about time for him to have dinner, and he's anticipating dinner. So he's having an anticipation response, and the neurons associated with anticipation are firing in his brain, and it's provoking mild stress in him because he wants that food, also causing him to yawn. Another scenario is that, he's in a very stressful situation. He doesn't like those pillows in the background. Those pillows are hideous. And he's stressed out. He's in a foreign environment, and he's stressed out and he's yawning. The point is, we can't tell just by looking at this yawn exactly what is going on inside of the Basset Hound's brain. There are multiple different brain activities that could contribute to the exact same behavior. And this is the problem with behavioral indicators, or the shortcoming, I would say, to date. So we have a grand challenge. Our grand challenge then is to actually understand animal experience in terms of what is happening inside the brain. And we've been helped by an explosion of research into neuroscience of humans in recent decades, which some would even say that the human mind is still considered a black box. So doing it in animals is probably an even greater challenge, but we're starting to make that leap. Just to give you a little bit of background about our team here at UQ, as Ben mentioned, I work for Professor Alan Tilburg, who's an animal neuroendocrinologist. So this brain stuff is his bread and butter. I am a decision scientist, as Ben said. So I'm very much interested in what kinds of evidence do we need to make good decisions about animal care. We also have on our team Dr. Elise Coe, who's a data scientist, and she specializes in complex systems, the analysis of multivariate data. And we have Bronwyn Venus, who's our research partnerships manager, who helps us a lot with stakeholder engagement, which I'll explain why is important for this area of work. Most of our funding comes from research and development corporations from the livestock industries. The livestock industries in Australia have profound interest in understanding animal welfare so that they can improve it. And many of our grants are funded through them. We also have funding from UQ, strategic funding. And you'll see that two of our grants are related to biomarkers of animal welfare, which is the research we'll be discussing now. So we have this grand challenge, and we have this team here, and we have a great team in animal science. But it's too big of a challenge just for us alone, because it's so complex understanding what an animal is experiencing. But thankfully, UQ has a lot of expertise if we look across UQ in all the multiple disciplines. In addition to that, UQ is well positioned, I would say, with regard to animal well-being and animal welfare because of the initiation of the Animal Welfare Collaborative, which I spoke about last time, I believe, that I gave a seminar. We chair the National Primary Industries Animal Welfare Research Development Extension Strategy, which is for livestock industries and research partners. We're on the board of ANSCART, which is for animals in research and teaching. We are a collaborating center for the OIE, which is sort of like if you think of the World Health Organization, but for animals. And we've also been invited by the federal government to participate in discussions on livestock export. So we're pretty well positioned in this regard. And we also have expertise across the university. Interestingly, though, a lot of this expertise is not just animal science. So in 2017, NARDIS, which is the livestock group that I mentioned earlier, commissioned a study to figure out where the capability was lacking in animal welfare research, development, and extension. And they found that a lot of the capability that was weak was not in animal science, but it was in all of the other disciplines. So engineering, for instance, animal housing engineering, psychology, understanding consumer psychology and producer psychology, applied sociology, ethics, community psychology, sociology. So these are all areas that UQ has a lot of expertise in. We thought, wow, if we could just harness all the expertise that already exists here across the multiple disciplines, we'd really have a powerful team to attack this challenge of animal experience. So we did that last year. We pulled together the multiple disciplines, anyone who had an interest in animals, basically, and who was already doing work related to animals or was interested in doing so. We invited them to join something called the UQ Partnership for Animal Wellbeing, or UQ-PAW. And what it is basically a one UQ approach to animal well-being, including all the different disciplines. So in 2020, it started, I would say, with discussions among QAFI, School of Veterinary Science, and School of Agriculture and Food Science, that this might be a really good idea for us all to collaborate in a one UQ approach to animal well-being. And then once we did that, we emailed heads of school and institute directors across the university saying, hey, look, is there anyone in your school or institute you think might be interested in this? And from that, we got about 70 academics who expressed interest, and many of them joined us in a workshop late last year. And so that workshop was really determining what the focus of this group was going to be and what our areas of activity would be. We have since formed committees for each of those areas of work, and those committees have begun to meet. These are just some of the beautiful people who have put their hand up to be involved in UQ-PAW, but there are many, many more. And to show you a little bit of the breadth of it, we have most schools and institutes across the university involved at this stage. So in the first workshop, it was decided that the focus would be on animal well-being as opposed to animal welfare. Animal welfare, as I said before, describes just the experience of the animal, whereas animal well-being is the broader system of ethical, cultural, economic, and social factors that affect the animal's welfare. For instance, putting dogs in Christmas sweaters. And so we have areas of activity that have been loosely constructed for UQPAW, and these are still under review. But these are the committee chairs for the different committees, and Michael McGowan is the chair of the steering committee. So these different committees will work on the activities here. Engagement, as I mentioned before, is a very strong pillar of UQPAW because we need to listen to all of the stakeholders in the livestock industries, at animal shelters, veterinarians, zoos and aquariums, to really understand what it is that people in the community need to take better care of their animals. Sorry, I'll just mention quickly, if you had expressed interest in one of these committees and you're thinking what's going on, this committee hasn't met yet, don't worry. Only the Transdisciplinary Education Committee has met yet. The others are about to meet in the next few months. It's not too late to join UQPAW and to become involved with any of these areas of activity. Please email me or one of the committee chairs if you would like to join. You're welcome to join. So this brings us back to our challenge of what an animal is experiencing, this animal here in particular. We put together a project over the last few months for UQPAW to work on together that we think could really advance our understanding of animal neuroscience and animal experience. The first pillar of activity focuses on animals, and I suppose you could say this could involve a traditional animal science. Alan Tilbrook and our collaborators at UWA, Dominic Blash, and UNE, Tamsin Crowley, have worked through our funding from MLA and now recently April to identify some putative biomarkers of brain function in animals that relate to their welfare status, positive or negative. And the idea is then to take these biomarkers, which have been done in sheep initially, and validate them in multiple species, going across, partnering with other experiments that are going on at UQ. So yes, the idea is to test it in multiple livestock species, wildlife species, and animals used in research and teaching, because as you know, UQ is also an end user of this knowledge. So because we have animals under our care for research and teaching. Then the next step would be to triangulate the biomarker data with neuroimaging studies so that we can say these blood markers or salival markers of hormones and brain activity are reflective of what's actually happening in the animal's brain. So to do this, we definitely need to rely on our collaboration with the Queensland Brain Institute, and we've been in discussion with them about this, and they're part of this project. Then we need to, I think I skipped ahead here, but anyway, the syringe is here to show that all of these at the moment rely on taking blood samples from animals, but ideally that is not our end game. We would want to be able to do this non-invasively. So the next step then is to test this technology, test various technologies using non-invasive optical sensing techniques for their correlation against the biomarker dynamics. And then to customize these technologies for on-farm or laboratory use or wildlife reserve use, and optimize the data storage, transmission, analysis for remote use. The idea being that it will give a lifetime analysis of the animal's welfare, and that could be delivered to the end user, say the farmer. So as I said, blood being most invasive, we want to move down this ladder to minimally invasive and non-invasive techniques of studying an animal's experience. And to do this, we'll test various technologies that using optical sensing, such as near-infrared spectroscopy, mid-infrared spectroscopy, Raman, thermal imaging, and so on, to try to get to a state where we are non-invasive. But the data produced by these optical sensing technologies is quite complex, and you wouldn't necessarily want to be interpreting it throughout your daily work as a farmer or as an animal shelter worker, say. So we need to understand what is the best format to present these data, and what exactly the end users want to know. So here on the right, I show a library because we also don't have time as an end user. I don't have time to go through all of the scholarly literature to try to find what I'm looking for either. So the last pillar, people, is also very important because it looks at what the market demand is and the use cases are in industry, government, and community for this technology of biomarkers and animal experience, and looking at the kinds of decisions those people make and what sort of parameters affect those decisions. So we need to go and talk with end users, basically, and we've involved the School of Psychology for this. Also, the UQ Business School using their design thinking methodology to design a user platform that is easy to use, user-friendly. And also, we've involved quite a few people from philosophy, because even if you have data on what the animal is experiencing, you still have to make a judgment call on whether that's good or bad. And that's where ethics comes into play about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in terms of the welfare of the animal. So the idea is that all of these streams of activity will be working in tandem across the university, the multiple schools and institutes, collaborating with each other, and that all of this can feed into something we're calling the Wellmark platform, which is a real-time assessment of animal well-being, and that we can do a study at UQ to verify this prototype system with animals that are used in teaching currently, and that then this technology can later be used or commercialized or transitioned into a CRC. So our proposed solution that we're trying to work towards as a collaborative effort is really about taking responsibility for the well-being of animals under our care. And for UQ especially, that means the animals that are here and that are being used for research and teaching. But we want to help other end users in industry and government community to do that for their animals as well. And it's about having adequate evidence of animal experience on which to base our decisions. And that's where the brain markers come into play. So yes, our approach to this has been to collaborate. We think it would be silly to not collaborate given how enormous this challenge is. And that's where the UQ Partnership for Animal Wellbeing, this is one area of activity that UQ is undertaking in research, but there will likely be many more areas of activity for UQ PAW. And yes, that's it for me. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. That was a fascinating seminar. So if you've got questions, please type them into the Q&A box there, and we'll be watching that. So question from me, Jill. You'll have to think very carefully, I guess, about how you assay these biomarkers, and in particular, what tissue or method you use, because, for example, taking a blood sample might distress the animals more than they're already distressed. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so ideally, with the preliminary studies we're doing, we're looking at blood and saliva. It would be great if we could rely more on saliva. It depends on whether those markers actually show up in the saliva, whether they reach that peripheral level. But also, the early experiments are in very controlled environments with animals that are already habituated to having their blood taken. So ideally, that doesn't provoke a stress response. The blood in itself doesn't provoke a stress response. And we'll be taking blood from both groups, so also that will help to be able to see a difference between the groups. All the experiments that we plan with this broader project will be experiments that researchers at UQ already have planned, so they know the animals they work with best, but we'll be looking for experiments that we can piggyback on where we don't have any additional impact or stress on the animal, ideally.
Great, thanks. I'm just checking our Q&A. So we've got one from Anonymous. Thanks, Anonymous. Where are you on this process right now? So I guess what stage are you at in the research?
So at the moment, we've identified biomarkers of brain function in sheep, and we have another experiment planned, a year-long experiment starting in June, to validate those and explore those further, see how they change with different welfare conditions. But we'll need to validate them in multiple species. The techniques for extracting those markers and measuring them has been our main focus. But now that we know that we can extract and measure them, we really need to look at different welfare states, positive and negative. The positive ones are actually much more difficult to provoke than the negative ones. But we'll need to do that in sheep and then validate it in the multiple different animal species that we mentioned. So I would say we're still at the end of the discovery phase, and we would like to now transition into application.
Great. Okay, we've got a good question coming in from Arla, and she says, I think getting cattle into a crush is the stressful part of taking samples like blood or even saliva to the cattle, that is. What do you think? Unless there's a way to calmly walk among the herd and collect a sample, my experience is, and Arla's had a lot of experience doing this, they get scared when we do that as well.
Yeah, that's true, Arla. Being handled in and of itself can be a stressful experience. So we'll need to work out how we can do that in a way and wait for them to calm down and collect samples. So it's going to take some tweaking, I think, and some experimenting to try to get a way of collecting samples that doesn't provoke additional stress. We possibly by habituating them to this over multiple sessions.
Just as an aside, there's a technology out there for assessing whether cattle are pregnant or not, and it uses a breath sample from the animals. So it must assay progesterone or something in the breath.
Yeah.
We're about to look at measuring methane with machines that read the breath of cattle. Be interesting to see if we could work together to use the same machines or adapt them to measure stress as well. Yep.
Yeah, that would be excellent, because that would be completely non-invasive, which is what we're after.
Yep.
And we have done, Alan is telling me that we have done preliminary measures of breath, and collaborating would be good.
So we've got a question from Matthew Morrell, which is a good question. Do you have any projection of the scale of the disruption to research and industry over the next decade if there are no effective technical methods to objectively assess animal stress levels?
The disruption to research, to animals used in research?
Yeah, so I guess Matthew means, is research on animals going to be shut down if you don't solve this problem? Is it going to not matter that much, or what's your feeling on where this is going?
I think it's a very large risk for us as researchers that we could be forced to use alternative models. I know this is something that the Animal Ethics Unit, of course, is already looking at UQ. Where we can use alternative models, we are, but it's definitely in their risk management strategy to try to rely more and more on non-animal models. also in teaching, using virtual reality and other techniques where you don't actually have to manipulate a live animal. So I think the university is already thinking that way, because it is a very large risk.
Great. We've got a question from Roy. Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious to know more about the difference between animal welfare and well-being. Are there any other countries also looking at well-being, and what's the international experience?
Okay. So I suppose in terminology, we had a look at this in one of the papers we wrote. There is a bit of confusion around terminology in animal welfare and animal well-being. Most of the theory has come out of Europe, and the definition for the OIE and has been expanded upon. It's a broader definition of basically what the animal is experiencing and everything, all of the duties that we have to animals. So for scientific purposes, we separate those two because one, we want to know what the animal is experiencing, but also at an ethical level, we have duties to animals, but we try to keep those separate as separate units of study, I suppose, which is why we delineate between welfare and well-being. But most people, I suppose, out there would use the two terms interchangeably. Europe has been, I suppose, the most advanced in looking at ways to improve animal welfare and animal well-being. This has been, as I mentioned, because of the rise of the trend in the UK, started by Ruth Harrison and the Bramble Committee, and so a lot of things have come out of the UK, but other European countries have been quite progressive in animal welfare.
Great, thanks. We've got a question from Arla, and she's asking about ear tag sensors to monitor behaviour, including stress, I guess. Mm-hmm. And she points out that, as you probably know, PhD student Cameron is looking at this in response to buffalo flies.
Yep. Yeah, so I know that there's ear tag technologies have advanced a lot in recent years in terms of the sensitivity of the things they can measure. So ear tag technologies are a behavioural indicator of welfare, so how the animal's behaving. And as I mentioned before, this can be a little bit confounding with different factors that affect behaviour. But I suppose in theory, if there were a really good model of behaviour that could be sensitive to stressors, but also specific to the type of stressor, that would be the most useful. So I think that research is really important, getting research not on just is the animal stressed or not, but are we able to figure out why the animal is stressed? Is it a specific type of stressor that's provoking it? For instance, the anticipation of food as opposed to heat stress, as opposed to isolation, that sort of thing. So that research is really needed.
Great, yep. And Timothy Biffins made a useful comment that if you're doing research on animals and using animals for scientific purposes, you should be familiar with these definitions, well-being and welfare, and to look at the Australian Code for Care and Use of Animals. So all of us working with animals should be very familiar with that. It's a useful comment.
Yes, thanks, Timothy.
Then a curly one from Tim Marnie. He says, with prey animals, the flight response is a natural behaviour. Might this be confused with poor welfare, resulting in unintended consequences of the research?
Yeah, so that's true, Tim. This is a natural behaviour, so all of these responses are completely natural. So I guess in animal welfare, there is a bit of debate about whether stress is always bad, or whether there are acceptable levels of stress. Obviously, we want animals to react to protect themselves in stressful situations. For our purposes of caring for animals, we want to make sure that we're not inflicting undue stress on the animal. But if the animal's faced with a predator, we want the animal to be able to respond, and we would expect a stress response in that situation. So that's also where this gets quite complex, because we don't want 100% positive, no stress all the time. That would be completely unrealistic and actually unhealthy.
Good. If you've got any more questions, please type them in. Just a quick question from me. If I know you can't compare humans and cattle in the way they respond and their welfare and so on, and doing so is not the right thing to do. But just from a scientific viewpoint, if you compare the image of a human brain and a cow brain under high stress levels, and I'm not sure if anyone's done that, is the basic response the same in the brain? This is to sort of an extreme stress, or are they still very different between species, between mammals?
Yeah, so I may have to rely on Alan for a little bit here. He said human and animal physiology are remarkably similar. And from an evolutionary perspective, that would make sense, because this, as Tim mentioned, because of the predator response, animals that had that ability to have a fight or flight response survived, and those that didn't did not. So this is something that's gone far back in our evolutionary history. So it's remarkably similar among animals. So we would expect a very similar response, which is why all of the great research that's being done on human neuroscience is really a great resource for us to look at and mine and try to figure out, can we measure these things in animals as well? So it's pretty fascinating, and we're really fortunate that there is that similarity we can draw on.
That's great. That was my next question. Can you use that information from humans? And sounds like you can.
Instead of using Alan's saying, so instead of using animals as models for humans, we can start using humans as models for animals.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a question from John Langbridge here, and he says, this is more of a statement than a question. Customers of the meat industries are becoming increasingly interested in how we can verify that the animals from which the meat comes from have had a good life. This work is very encouraging, as it may help the industry demonstrate this independently, or at least highlight areas that we need to improve on. So do you want to respond to that, Jill?
Thank you, John, for that feedback. Yes, that's exactly what we're hoping that a possible use of this technology could be. As I mentioned, with the evidence-based decisions trend that started with evidence-based medicine, really, I think one trend that you're probably seeing in your industry is that customers are no longer just satisfied to see a tick of approval that the animal is okay. They want to see that there's rigorous evidence behind that, and want to know what that tick means and what's actually being measured. So as mentioned, we don't have a lot of those measures currently, but that's something we're trying to work to provide.
Yep, great answer. And I think that's exactly what your research, Jill, and Alan's research is trying to establish.
Hopefully, yes. Thanks.
Lo has a question as well to finish off. When slaughtering animals, how do we know that the behaviour is a response linked to stress and not just a response to something that is new and unknown? That's a tricky one for you, Jill.
Yeah, so pulling apart the causes of the animal's physiology is really tricky, which is why we need controlled experiments to piece that apart. Because I mean, if we go up the chain of causality here, we said behavior, there's multiple things that can contribute to the same behavior. in terms of the neurophysiology. But then there are multiple causes that can provoke a stress response as well. So just seeing the stress response alone without understanding the context is not enough information. So really, we need to study first the stress response under a lot of different controlled conditions to piece apart how it looks different in those different scenarios. And then ideally study it in real world conditions as well, because it will be different.
Okay, thanks, Jill. We might finish up there if there are no questions.